They put a price on 28 years of my life. $4,000 is what I found behind that locked door.
For 28 years, Carol Whitmore cooked in their kitchen, sat at their table, and nursed their son through 9 years of illness, alone while they stayed away. When he died, they came back. Fast. The will gave Carol one thing: a forgotten workshop at the far end of town, padlocked, abandoned. The appraiser they hired put a number on it: $4,200. Her in-laws called it charity. What no one in that lawyer's office understood, not her brother-in-law, not her mother-in-law, not the man reading the numbers aloud, was that inside that rusted building, something had been waiting. Waiting. For 35 years. For someone to come through that door. The waiting room at Hargrove and Associates smelled of new carpet and cold air. The kind of cold that comes from a thermostat set too low on purpose. Carol Whitmore sat closest to the door. Her hands rested in her lap. No polish on the nails. On her right index finger, a faint smudge of graphite that wouldn't wash out. A leftover from 20 years of marking sheet music with a pencil. She hadn't touched sheet music in 9 years. The graphite stayed anyway. Someone had handed her coffee in the lobby. She hadn't taken a sip. She didn't put it down either. She just held it, the way you hold something when your hands need an assignment. The ring on her left hand caught the light. 28 years. She had been 27 when Frank Whitmore walked into her music room at Crockett Elementary. He stayed 2 hours, asked 3 questions about jazz theory that told her he actually knew something, then asked if she wanted coffee. His hands were warm. His laugh came easily, not performed but real, the kind that catches you off guard. His mother had not been at that coffee, but Nadine Whitmore made her presence felt in other ways. Quiet at the family table in a way that was not peace. It was assessment. She looked at Carol the way an appraiser looks at furniture, cataloging flaws, deciding whether it belonged in the room. Carol kept teaching. 4th grade music at Crockett. She was good at it in the specific way that matters. Not performance, not authority, but the ability to sit beside a child who believes she cannot do something and stay there, quietly, until the child proves herself wrong. Then 2014. Frank's heart. She left the job without a long conversation. My husband is sick. I need to be home. People nodded. What the simple sentences didn't carry was 9 years of 4 a.m. pulse readings, pharmacy runs in the rain, phone calls to Nadine that went to voicemail, holidays where Troy and Lila sent flowers instead of themselves. The last night, Frank had taken her hand in both of his. I owe you more than I can ever pay back. She had shaken her head. She had never needed him to pay her back. She had only needed him to stay. He couldn't manage that either. Nadine arrived without looking at Carol. Pearl earrings, linen blazer. She sat at the far end and folded her hands. Troy came in 2 minutes late, still buttoning his jacket. He had once remembered her birthday 3 years running, sent cards with actual handwriting. That was before the money got complicated. He dropped into a chair and stretched one leg into the aisle. Lila arranged herself more carefully, back straight, phone face down on her knees. Her thumb found the edge of the phone every few minutes, the kind of movement people make when they're waiting to hear something they already know. The lawyer read with the flat efficiency of a man who did this every week. The house on Seawall Boulevard, Carol's breath caught slightly, went to Nadine. She hadn't known Frank had retitled it in 2019, during the months after surgery when the pain medication made everything slow and agreeable. The investment accounts, divided 3 ways. The business, to Troy. Then Hargrove turned the page. To Carol Ann Whitmore, the property at 412 Oleander Street, known as the Whitmore Workshop, together with all contents and fixtures therein. Appraised value, $4,200. The number sat in the room, $4,200. Lila coughed, behind her hand. Troy nodded slowly, performing generosity. At least you'll have somewhere to go, Carol. Nadine said nothing. She looked at Carol across the dark table with the expression she had been using for 28 years. Not triumph, not contempt. Something quieter than both. The look of a person who has moved a piece exactly where she intended. Carol picked up the pen, signed where the tabs indicated. 3 places. She pushed her chair back under the table because she had been raised to leave rooms the way she found them. "Thank you," she said to the lawyer. She said nothing to the others. She was nearly to the exit when Lila appeared behind her. "Carol?" The careful smile was already in place. "If the property feels like too much to deal with right now, which is completely understandable, Troy would be happy to take it off your hands. He's thinking 6,000. Well over appraised value. We'd handle all the paperwork." Carol looked at her, at the smile, at the hand half extended, a gesture of warmth that stopped just short of contact. "Let me think about it," Carol said. She walked out into the October sun. On the top step, she stopped. Her fingers found the key in her jacket pocket. Heavy, old, the orange of rust that has had years to settle into iron. Someone had carried this every day once, reached for it without thinking. And then one November morning in 1988, the reaching had stopped. She closed her fingers around it. $6,000. For a building worth $4,200. A man who hadn't visited his dying brother in 4 years would drive across town on a Tuesday for that. People don't do that for things that are worthless. She put the key on the passenger seat where she could see it and pulled out of the lot. Why would they want to buy back something they'd just thrown away? 3 days after the reading, on a Tuesday morning when the Gulf wind smelled of salt and something still blooming, Carol drove alone down Oleander Street for the first time. The oleanders that gave the street its name were still there, pink and white, holding on into October with the stubbornness of things that don't know they're supposed to be done. Nobody tended them. Nobody removed them either. They just persisted, the way certain things in Galveston persist. She watched the numbers on the mailboxes. 398, 404, 408. She turned the corner. Carol pulled to the curb and turned off the engine. She did not get out. The fence came first. Wooden pickets leaning at angles. The white paint not peeling so much as dissolving. Coming away in flakes the shape and color of dried fish scales. Behind it, the weeds had taken everything. Sorghum, ragweed, a stand of pokeweed along the left side, berries gone dark purple, stalks thick as a child's wrist. They came up past the bottom windows of the building, which meant they had been coming up undisturbed for a long time. The building itself was low and wide, a working structure, not a pretty one. The roof was corrugated metal. The rust not orange, but the deep brownish red of an old wound that had stopped bleeding and never quite healed. On the left side, one window was gone entirely, the frame empty. But no weather had come through it. Something had come through instead. A wisteria vine, purple-flowered in its season, now dry and skeletal, had pushed through the gap and wound itself along the interior wall. The dead flowers from last spring still hung on the tendrils. The plant had made itself at home in the dark. The main door was steel. Someone had welded a crossbar across it from the outside. A deliberate sealing, not just a lock. Over the crossbar, a padlock the size of a fist, the same orange rust as the roof, the same color as the key in her jacket pocket. Carol sat with her hands in her lap and looked at it. This is what 28 years became. She got out of the car. The Gulf wind hit her when she opened the door. Salt and heat and that faint underlayer of old wood and metal coming from behind the fence. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she pushed open the gate, which scraped against the concrete and stuck halfway, and she pushed through the weeds toward the door. She was working the padlock, stiff, the key turning hard, when a voice came from the fence line to her right. "You're Frank's wife." Not a question. Carol turned. A woman stood at the low fence separating the workshop property from the house next door. 70s, hair cut short and white, a striped canvas apron, a glass of sweet tea sweating in the October warmth. She was looking at Carol the way people look at someone they've been expecting. "I am," Carol said. Carol. "Dorothy Marchand. Dottie." She gestured toward her porch with the tea glass. "Come sit a minute. I'll call Reuben. He's 2 streets over, has the equipment to get that crossbar off. Shouldn't take long." They sat on Dottie's front porch in mismatched chairs while Reuben was called and dispatched. The tea was cold and very sweet, the way Carol remembered tea being when she first moved to Texas and found the sweetness startling, then necessary. Dottie had lived next to the workshop for 31 years. She had known Earl, Frank's grandfather, for the last decade of his life. "Here every morning by 6, she said. Played records before he started work. People drove up from Houston, Louisiana. Brought him things nobody else could fix." She set her glass down. "He used to say, 'Instruments don't break. They just wait for the right person to listen.'" Carol said nothing. "When he died, November of '88, stroke. The family came and locked it up. 1 week. Nobody went in after that. Just fact. The way neighbors report things they couldn't change." Then Dottie looked at Carol directly and said something that rearranged the air on the porch. "Frank came by, about 2 years before he passed." Carol went still. "He sat right where you're sitting. We talked most of the afternoon." Dottie looked out toward the workshop, then back. "He left something with me. Asked me to hold on to it." A pause. "He was very specific about when I should give it to you. He said only if you came here yourself, only if you got the door open." She stood up. "But that's not for today. You go in first. See what's there." She went inside before Carol could respond. Reuben arrived 20 minutes later, cut the crossbar in 4 minutes with an angle grinder, and was gone before the metal had finished cooling. The padlock opened on the 3rd try. The key had to be held at a slight angle, something Carol wouldn't have known without working at it. She put both hands on the door and pushed. The hinges had not moved in 35 years. They announced this clearly. The sound was long and low and final sounding, like a door in a place that had stopped expecting visitors. Then it was open. The smell came first. Not rot, not mildew. Something drier than that. Old wood, machine oil, and underneath both, something faintly sweet that Carol couldn't place immediately. The wisteria, she realized. The dry vine on the interior wall, releasing something into the still air. She raised her phone and turned on the flashlight. The space was larger than the exterior suggested. The ceiling ran up 14 feet at the center ridge. The concrete floor was swept, or had been 35 years ago, and the dust had settled evenly since then, undisturbed. Along the left wall, a workbench ran the full length of the room. The tools were still there, arranged. A pegboard above the bench with outlines drawn in marker showing where each tool belonged, and every tool in its place. Chisels, files, gauges she didn't recognize. All of it covered in the same even layer of dust, the way a room looks when it's been sealed rather than abandoned. Along the right wall, shelves, oak, solidly built, the kind of shelving that doesn't shift. On the shelves, Objects wrapped in canvas, some small, some long and narrow, dozens of them. Each one tagged with a small paper label, handwriting too small to read from where she stood. Above the workbench, a calendar. November 1988. The page had never been turned. Carol walked slowly along the shelves. Her flashlight moved across the canvas shapes. She reached out and touched one. Medium-sized, rounded at one end, narrowing toward the other. Her hand curved around the shape before her mind named it. Violin, the neck, the body, the slight curve of the waist. She had not held a violin in 9 years, but her hand still remembered exactly how. She stood there a moment, with her palm against the canvas. 47 years since her first lesson, a summer program, 9 years old, fingers that wouldn't cooperate, a sound like a gate that needed oiling. She had gone back the next week, and the week after that. Instruments don't break. They just wait for the right person to listen. She moved on. At the back of the room, in the corner where the light from the door didn't reach, something was different. She almost missed it. Behind a tall shelf unit, pushed close to the wall, not quite flush, a shape that didn't match the others. She angled the flashlight. A cabinet. Steel. Roughly the height of her shoulder. The paint had once been green, now flaked to gray at the edges. No handle. No visible lock mechanism. The seams along the edges had been welded shut. She could see the bead of old weld along the top and sides. Amateur work, done by someone with a purpose rather than a trade. On the face of the cabinet, at eye level, 2 letters had been cut into the metal. Not stamped, not painted. Carved by hand, with something sharp, each stroke deliberate. E.W. She stood in front of it and listened. Ticking. Faint. Steady. Coming from inside. She leaned closer. Pressed her ear near the seam. Still ticking. Something inside that welded steel cabinet had been running for 35 years. She did not touch it. She took a step back and looked at it. At the hand-cut initials. At the welded seams. At the green paint wearing thin on the corners from 35 years of nothing. Earl Whitmore had sealed something inside this cabinet, and it was still keeping time. She had not touched it. She had only stood there, in the dark, listening. And the ticking continued, steady and unhurried, like something that had been waiting a very long time and had learned not to rush. The next morning, Carol drove back to Oleander Street with Frank's old gardening gloves, a pair of hedge clippers, and no plan beyond the first hour. Day 1. The gloves were too big. Frank's hands had been larger than hers. She had always known this in an abstract way, the way you know things about a person you've lived beside for decades without cataloging them. Wearing his gloves made it specific. The thumb hung loose. The right palm had a worn patch from whatever he'd used them for last. Some project she couldn't remember now. She put them on anyway. The weeds along the fence line were chest-high in places and had roots that didn't want to let go. She worked from the gate inward, clipping and pulling, filling the contractor bags she'd bought at the hardware store on the way over. The October sun in Galveston is not a gentle thing, even when the calendar says it should be. By 10 o'clock, her shirt was soaked through. The shoulder started hurting around 2 in the afternoon. Not sharp, the dull, deep kind that settles in and doesn't leave. She kept working. She did not think about Frank while she worked. She thought about the next handful of weeds and the next bag, and whether the gate would open fully once the growth along the hinge side was cleared. This was not avoidance. It was the only way she knew to move through something, keep her hands busy until the rest of her caught up. By 4 o'clock, the front of the property was clear. She drove home, ate soup from a can, was asleep by 9. Day 4. She had been working her way through the interior, sweeping, organizing, learning the layout the way you learn a new house, by moving through it slowly until it stops feeling foreign. In the center drawer of Earl's workbench, under a flat measuring tool she didn't recognize, she found a small notebook, spiral-bound, the cover worn soft. She opened it. Every tool in the workshop was listed, each one numbered. For each, a name, a purchase date, a manufacturer, a note about condition at time of purchase. The handwriting was small and upright, with a slight lean to the right. The writing of someone who had learned penmanship in a different era and kept the habit. She went to the pegboard above the bench, found tool number 14, a set of files, fine cut, Swiss-made, purchased 1961, good condition, slight wear on handle. She looked at the files. They were exactly where the outline on the pegboard said they should be. Earl Whitmore had numbered his tools and documented where they lived. This man did not leave anything by accident. She put the notebook back in the drawer, exactly where she'd found it. Day 7. She had pulled the canvas cover from the first shelf, carefully, the way you remove something that has been in place a long time and deserves to be treated accordingly. Underneath, a mandolin. Small-bodied, the spruce top darkened with age to the color of good honey. She ran a finger along the back. Maple, the grain still visible under the decades. The tuning pegs were wooden, hand-carved. The frets were intact. She set her palm against the body of it. Her left hand moved before she told it to. Fingers curved, finding a shape on the neck. The first chord position she had learned at 22 in a workshop at the community center downtown. G major, the most forgiving chord, the one every beginner starts with. She hadn't played anything in 9 years. Her hand still knew exactly where to go. She stood there for a moment, with her palm on the body and her left hand forming a chord she wasn't playing. Then she set the mandolin carefully back on the shelf and replaced the canvas. She sat down on the floor with her back against the shelving unit. The concrete was cool through her jeans. The shoulder was hurting again. Both hands were stiff. She had cleared 3 more bags of debris from the back corner that morning, swept the floor twice, and cataloged 6 more shelves of covered instruments in the notebook she'd started keeping. She had not cried since Frank's funeral. She cried now. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the kind of crying that happens when you've been holding something too long and your arms finally give out. She cried for Frank, and for the music room at Crockett Elementary she had left and never gone back to, and for the 9 years of pill organizers and insurance forms, and for the mandolin on the shelf that someone had kept safe in the dark for 35 years while nobody came. Dottie's cat, a black one, elderly, who had begun appearing at the workshop door 3 days ago and now acted as though he had always lived there, walked over and sat beside her without being invited. She let him stay. When her phone buzzed, she almost didn't check it, a number she didn't recognize. She looked anyway. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Becca Nguyen. I don't know if you remember me. I was in your 3rd grade music class in 2005. I heard about Mr. Frank and I'm so sorry. I just wanted you to know that what you taught me, I still use it. Every day. I hope you're okay. Carol read it twice. She didn't reply. She set the phone face down on the concrete, leaned her head back against the shelf, and stayed there until the crying was finished. Then she got up and went back to work. She drove home in the dark. Made dinner she didn't taste. Lay in bed with the window open until Galveston quieted down around her. Week 2, Tuesday. Reuben arrived at 8 with his tools and Dottie's coffee. He worked on the welded cabinet for 2 hours. Carol stayed in the workshop, moving around him, continuing her inventory. She had learned not to watch someone else work at something she couldn't help with. When the last weld gave way, Reuben stepped back. "All yours," he said. He accepted the cash she handed him, declined the offer of more coffee, and left with the same efficiency he'd brought the first time. Carol stood in front of the open cabinet. The ticking was louder now. She found its source. A small clock mechanism mounted to the inside of the door. A tiny pendulum behind glass no bigger than a silver dollar. Still moving. 35 years. Earl had built something to keep the air moving. To keep whatever was inside safe. She looked at the rest. Small wooden boxes, a dozen of them, each labeled in that same upright hand. Parts, mechanisms, things she couldn't name yet but recognized as being organized by someone who knew exactly what they were for. And a journal. Thick, leather-covered, the spine cracked but intact. She lifted it out carefully. The leather was dry but not brittle. She opened to the inside front cover. Earl James Whitmore, January 1955. She turned pages. Repairs, sketches, customers' names going back decades. Then she turned to the back. The last entry was dated November 14th, 1988. Frank came by today, 8 years old. Still prefers sitting in here watching me work to going outside. I don't mind the company. Working on the mandolin for Margaret. Promised her in 1972. She's been gone 6 years now, and I'm still not finished. No need to rush. She knows I'll get there. I'm leaving it here for her. Carol read it again. He had promised his wife a handmade mandolin in 1972. She had died before he finished it. He had kept working on it for 6 more years. And when he wrote this, he still wasn't done. He wrote about it the way you write about something you have every intention of completing. Not with grief, with patience. 2 days after this entry, he was gone. She closed the journal, held it in both hands. In the bottom of the cabinet, behind the wooden boxes, she saw the envelope, white, sealed. The handwriting on the front was not Earl's. She knew Earl's hand now, had spent a week learning it. This was different, larger, a slight lean to the right. For Dorothy, when she finds her way here. F.W. Frank. She picked it up, held it. She put it back in the cabinet. Not yet. She sat down in Earl's chair. Wooden, straight-backed, worn smooth at the armrests, and opened the journal again to the last page. The clock ticked inside the empty cabinet. The afternoon light came in through the window she had cleaned 4 days ago, falling across the workbench, across the tools in their numbered places, across Earl's careful handwriting on the page in her lap. Frank had sat in this room, in this exact light, at 8 years old, watching hands that knew how to finish what they started. He had grown up and forgotten that lesson, but he had sent Carol here to remember it for him. She sat with the journal open in her lap, the clock still ticking inside the empty safe, the last light of the afternoon falling across Earl's careful handwriting, and she understood, for the first time, that she had not inherited a building. She had inherited an unfinished sentence. That evening she made a list. Names to trace. A violin from a family named Levy, 1987, never collected. A mandolin still waiting for its maker. At the bottom, talk to Dottie. Troy Whitmore. What did he know and when? Because Dottie had told her something, on the 8th day, over gumbo gone slightly cold. About 5 years ago, Dottie had said, setting down her bowl. Troy Whitmore came to see me. Carol had gone still. Troy had come alone, asked if Dottie had a key to the workshop. She'd said no. He'd asked if she knew anything about what Earl had left inside. She'd said no. He'd stood at the fence for a long time before he got back in his car. He knew something, Dottie had said. He wasn't guessing. He was looking for something specific. Did he say what? No. Dottie had picked up her bowl again. But I remembered the car, dark blue Silverado, and I remembered how long he stood there, 5 years ago, before Frank's last surgery, before the will, before any of this. Troy had been looking for something in that workshop for 5 years, and Carol had found her way in on day 3. 3 weeks into her work at the workshop, on a Wednesday morning when the wisteria outside the broken window had begun putting out new green shoots, Lila Whitmore drove up Oleander Street with a box of pastries and a smile Carol had learned to read 20 years ago. Carol heard the gate before she saw who it was. She was at Earl's workbench, learning the grain, the way the wood had worn down where the same hands worked for 30 years. The bench told her things, if she paid attention. She went to the window. Lila was coming up the cleared path in a blazer the color of cream, carrying a white pastry box tied with ribbon. The kind of box that comes from the sort of bakery that has a name in script on the lid. Not the kind of thing you bring to a worksite. The kind of thing you bring when you want to establish that you are doing someone a favor. Carol went to the door. I was in the neighborhood, Lila said. The smile arrived first, before the words. I thought, she's been out here working so hard. The least I can do. She held out the box. That's kind of you, Carol said. She did not take the box. A small pause. Lila set the box on the nearest flat surface, the top of a sawhorse Carol had brought from home, and looked around the workshop with the particular attention of someone cataloging rather than admiring. You've done a lot, she said. It looks like a lot of work. It is, Carol said. I was actually talking to Troy about that. Lila turned back, the smile recalibrated. He's been worried about you, honestly. Taking all this on by yourself it's a lot for anyone. She let the unfinished sentence do its work. The offer still stands. He'd go to $8,000 now. He spoke to someone about the property, and the number moved. The number moved. 6,000 2 weeks ago, 8,000 today, a building they had appraised at $4,200. The zoning situation is going to complicate things, Lila continued. This area is flagged for commercial redevelopment. If the city moves forward, the value drops. Troy's trying to help you get out ahead of that. Carol looked at her. At the careful construction of it. The concern, the warning, the offer, arranged in the right order, like furniture placed to direct foot traffic. I appreciate him thinking of me, Carol said. I'll let you know. Lila held the smile for 1 beat longer than natural. Then she picked the pastry box back up. She wasn't leaving it now, Carol noticed, and said she'd see herself out. Carol went back to the window. Lila stopped at the gate, took out her phone, photographed the front of the building from the left, then straight on, then from the right. 3 angles, unhurried. The way you photograph something you're planning to use later. She did not look back toward the window. People who are worried about someone don't photograph their building. That evening, Carol ate at her kitchen table with Earl's journal open beside her plate. She had been reading it in sections, not straight through, but the way you read something you want to absorb rather than finish. An entry here, a sketch there. The 1963 repair of a parlor guitar. The strings corroded, but the top still sound. The 1971 clock, a mantelpiece. French movement. The owner convinced it was beyond saving. It wasn't, Earl had written. It just needed someone to look past the obvious damage. Her phone rang. The name on the screen, Nadine Whitmore. She set down her fork, let it ring once more, then answered. Carol. Nadine's voice was warm in the specific way that cost nothing. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all. I've been thinking about you. This whole situation, it can't be easy. Starting over at your age, dealing with a property that needs so much work. A pause timed to feel like genuine consideration. I want you to know that whatever happened between us in the past, I don't hold any of it against you. Frank loved you. That matters to me. Carol said nothing. She had learned over 28 years that silence made Nadine move faster than argument. Troy mentioned he spoke with Lila today. I want you to hear it from me directly. The offer is real and it's fair. $25,000. That's more than 6 times what the property assessed for. You could use that money to actually start fresh. A real apartment. Somewhere you're not driving across town every day to clean up an old building. $25,000. The number had jumped from 8,000 to 25 in the same afternoon. Carol looked at the journal open on the table. Earl's note from 1977 in the margin beside a mandolin repair. She apologized for its condition. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. The instrument had been used. That's what instruments are for. I'll think about it, Carol said. Thank you for calling. She ended the call. Sat for a moment with her hand on the phone. Then she opened her contacts and found Ruben's number. He answered on the second ring. Ruben, it's Carol Whitmore. I need to ask you something. Security cameras, the kind that record to your phone. Can you install something like that at the workshop? Sure, he said. When do you want it done? This week, if you can. He could. Thursday. She hung up and went back to her dinner, which had gone cold. She ate it anyway. She had spent 28 years waiting to be asked what she wanted. She was done waiting. Ruben installed 2 cameras on Thursday. One covering the front entrance, one covering the rear, both motion-activated, both feeding to an app on her phone. He tested them twice, showed her the settings, and left before noon. She didn't think much about them after that. There were other things to think about. The alert came at 2:14 in the morning. Carol was asleep. The phone lit up on the nightstand. The sound, a short double tone she'd set for security alerts, pulled her up before she was fully awake. She sat up, looked at the screen. Motion detected. Rear entrance. She opened the app. The footage was in infrared, white figures against a gray-black background, the image grainy but clear enough. 2 people at the rear door of the workshop. One tall, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had thought about this in advance. The other shorter, standing back, watching the street. The tall one had a crowbar. Carol watched the screen with both hands around the phone. She called 911, gave the address, described what she was seeing. Then she called Dottie. I'm coming, Dottie said, before Carol had finished the second sentence. The police arrived in 9 minutes. By then, the 2 figures were gone. The rear door showed fresh damage along the lower hinge. They had gotten partway through before the siren of an approaching car sent them off. The officers walked the perimeter, asked their questions. Carol showed them the footage on her phone, and they watched it with the professional attention of people who knew how to read this kind of thing. Near the end of the clip, the tall figure turned. 1 second, maybe 2. He looked back, not at the camera, just back, the instinct of someone checking his exit. The infrared caught him straight on. Carol recognized the jaw first, then the set of the shoulders. Troy. She looked at the screen and said nothing for a moment. 28 years, and still, somehow, she was surprised. She shouldn't have been. Dottie arrived 4 minutes after the police. Hair uncombed, coat pulled over her nightclothes, moving faster than Carol had seen her move. She stood beside Carol on the sidewalk while the officers finished their report, and she looked at the street the way a person looks at something they're memorizing. "There," she said quietly. Carol followed her gaze. 40, maybe 50 yards down, parked with its lights off but engine running, the exhaust faintly visible in the night air. A dark SUV. Black or very dark blue, hard to tell under the streetlight. The driver's window was open 2 inches. Inside, a shape, sitting straight, not looking at a phone, not leaning back, just sitting upright, watching the front of the workshop with the stillness of someone who had been there a while and planned to stay until it was over. "That car," Dottie said. "It's been here before. A month ago, maybe. Middle of the afternoon. I was pulling weeds and I noticed it because it sat too long." "Lexus?" "I think so. Couldn't see the plates from my yard." They stood there until the SUV pulled away, unhurried. It moved down Oleander and turned left and was gone. The officer with the clipboard came back. "Ma'am, do you have any idea who might want access to this property?" Carol looked at the frozen frame still open on her phone. The shoulders, the jaw, the angle of a face she had sat across from at holiday dinners for 15 years. "I think," she said, "I need to call a lawyer first." Dottie's kitchen smelled of coffee and something sweet. A candle burned down to its last inch on the windowsill, next to a cactus that had, improbably, decided to bloom red that morning. Carol had not slept. At 6, she gave up and drove to Dottie's door. Not the workshop, not yet. She didn't want to be alone with what she'd seen on that screen. Dottie opened the door before Carol knocked. She had already made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, without talking much at first. The kitchen was small, yellow walls gone soft with years, family photographs arranged on one wall with no apparent system, as though added over time wherever there was space. A child's drawing, framed, hung between a wedding photo and a picture of someone Carol didn't recognize standing beside a boat. The cactus on the windowsill had 3 red flowers opening at once, a house where things accumulated because they mattered, not because they were arranged. Carol wrapped both hands around her mug. "Troy," she said, not a question. "I know," Dottie said. They drank their coffee. After a while, Dottie pushed back her chair. She went down the hall and came back carrying something. An envelope, regular-sized, sealed, wrapped in a single layer of clear plastic. The kind of wrap you find in a kitchen drawer. Practical, deliberate. She set it on the table between them. "Frank brought this 2 years ago," Dottie said. "He came on a Tuesday afternoon. We sat on the porch and talked for a long time." She looked at the envelope, then at Carol. He was very clear about the condition. Only if you came to the workshop yourself. Only if you got the door open. If you never came, he said to keep it or throw it away. He said you'd know what to do once you were ready, and if you weren't ready, the letter wouldn't help anyway. She stood up. "I'll be in the garden." The back door opened and closed. Carol sat with the envelope. The handwriting on the front was Frank's. She would know it anywhere. Had seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the yellow legal pads he used for notes during the years of hospitals. But this wasn't the handwriting of those years. The letters were larger, more certain. He had written her name when his hand was still steady. Carol. Just that. She peeled away the plastic wrap carefully, folded it once and set it aside, opened the envelope along the top, the way she always opened envelopes, with her finger rather than tearing. 3 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper he had always used. Both sides of the first 2 pages, half the third. She read it at the pace it deserved. He did not begin with, "I'm sorry." He began with, "I want you to know the truth," and she understood immediately why he had chosen that instead. An apology can be reflexive. It can be the thing you say because you don't know what else to say, or because you want to feel better about something you did. What Frank was offering was different. The truth was harder. The truth required him to look at himself without the softening that apology allows. He wrote that he had not stood up for her. Not once in 28 years in the ways that mattered. Not when his mother made her silences felt at the dinner table. Not when Troy made the comments he made at holidays, the ones everyone pretended not to hear. Not when the family treated her absence at events as an oversight and her presence as an inconvenience. He had told himself it was keeping the peace. He wrote that now. I told myself I was keeping the peace, with the flatness of a man who had stopped believing his own explanation. The truth was simpler and worse. He had been afraid of his mother since he was 6 years old, when his father died, and Nadine became the fixed point around which everything else organized itself. He had spent his life not crossing her. It had become so habitual he had stopped noticing he was doing it. He was not asking Carol to excuse this. He was asking her to understand the difference between a man who doesn't love you and a man who is too afraid to show it the way it needed to be shown. She turned the page. The house. He wrote about the house. In the fall of 2019, 8 months after his second surgery, he had signed a document his mother brought to the hospital during the worst week of his recovery. He had been on pain medication strong enough that reading felt like trying to see through water. He had signed because she told him it was routine, something about the estate, something the lawyer needed. He had trusted her. He found out what he had signed 3 months later, when he was well enough to read carefully again. By then, the transfer was recorded. The house on Seawall was in Nadine's name. His lawyer told him the options were limited and expensive and uncertain. He had $47,000 in a savings account Nadine didn't know about, and a body that had already been through 2 surgeries. He did not have the energy for a legal fight he might not win. "That was the first time I saw her clearly," he wrote. "Not as my mother, but as someone who had made a calculation and acted on it. I don't know how to tell you how that felt. I'm not sure there are words for it that don't sound like self-pity, which I don't want to give you." She turned the second page. His handwriting changed slightly in the last section. Not worse, more deliberate, as though he had written this part more slowly. He had opened a pod account at First National Bank Galveston, payable on death, directly to Carol, outside of the estate, outside of the will, not subject to probate or contest. The balance was $47,000. He wrote the account number. He wrote the branch address on Seawall and the main phone number. He had also taken out a life insurance policy in 2020, the year after the house. $180,000. Carol Whitmore, sole beneficiary. He wrote the company name, the policy number, the claims phone number, and the name of the agent who had sold it to him, a man named Gerald Fuentes, who had been straightforward and asked no unnecessary questions. He wrote, I couldn't protect you the way I promised I would the day we got married. But I could prepare things so that you could protect yourself when I was gone. I know the difference, and I know it isn't the same thing. Then, at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that had slowed down even further, as though he wanted to make sure each word was correctly placed, Earl's workshop. You'll understand why I sent you there once you've been inside. He was the best of what the Whitmore family could have been. He worked quietly, and he finished what he started, and he never asked for anyone's approval. You deserved to know him. I'm sorry it took this long to introduce you. I love you. I always did. I just didn't always know how to make that mean something. Frank. Carol read the last page again. Then she folded the letter along its original creases. He had folded it himself before sealing the envelope, and the creases were already there, asking to be followed. She folded it the way it had been folded, set it back in the envelope. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold while she was reading. She drank it anyway. Through Dottie's window, the workshop was visible across the fence, rust-red roof, wisteria moving against the wall. From here it looked smaller, a building that kept its secrets until you came through the door. Frank had known she would come through the door. He had known, even then, that the workshop would do what he could not. She sat with that for a moment. Then she took out her phone. Not Troy's number. Not Nadine's. She scrolled to a name Dottie had mentioned the previous week. A lawyer downtown. Family law and estate disputes. Someone Dottie described as the kind of person who doesn't back down when she should, and who charges a fair rate because she doesn't need to overcharge. Renata Vasquez. Family law and estate litigation. Carol pressed call. It rang twice. Vasquez Law. My name is Carol Whitmore, she said. I think I need a lawyer. I have some documents I need someone to look at, and a situation that's getting complicated. Can you come in Thursday? Yes, Carol said. I can. She hung up, set the phone on the table, looked at the envelope with Frank's handwriting on the front. He had wrapped the letter in plastic. Gulf Coast Air Curls paper, Blur's ink. He had thought about that. Had sat somewhere in 2021 on one of his good days and thought, this needs to survive until she finds it. So he had wrapped it. Frank had finally kept his promise, just not the way either of them had imagined. Dottie came back in from the garden with dirt on her hands and the unhurried manner of someone who had given privacy the time it needed. She looked at Carol, at the envelope on the table, at the phone. Lawyer, Carol said. Dottie nodded once, went to the sink to wash her hands. Earl would have liked you, she said with her back turned, water running. He liked people who showed up and did the work. Carol looked out the window at the workshop. I'm still learning the work, she said. That's how it starts, Dottie said. She dried her hands and poured them both more coffee. And they sat together in the yellow kitchen while the cactus bloomed red on the windowsill and the morning moved forward the way mornings do, without asking permission, without waiting for you to be ready. Renata Vasquez's office was on the second floor of a building that had survived 3 hurricanes and smelled like it. Brick walls, ceiling fan with one wobbling blade, coffee that had been sitting since morning. Carol took the stairs. The door was open. Renata was 34, with dark hair pulled back and the posture of someone who had learned early that rooms don't take you seriously unless you take up space in them. She shook Carol's hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and picked up the documents Carol had brought before Carol had fully sat down. She read without speaking. The ceiling fan turned. Somewhere below, a delivery truck idled on the street. Renata stopped at one page, read a section again, then looked up. Who drafted this language? She turned the document around and placed her finger on a line near the bottom of the bequest clause. Carol leaned forward to read it. Together with all contents, fixtures, materials, and equipment situated within and upon the property, including any items stored therein. I don't know, Carol said. Hargrove's office prepared the will. Renata picked up her phone and dialed. She did not put it on speaker, but the office was small enough that Carol could hear the receptionist, the hold music, and then Hargrove himself, cautious and slightly formal. The conversation took 11 minutes. Renata asked 3 questions and let Hargrove talk. She wrote 2 things on her legal pad, underlined one of them, and said thank you in a tone that meant the conversation was finished. She set the phone down. Nadine Whitmore requested that specific language, Renata said. She called Hargrove's office personally and asked that the clause be expanded to include all contents and materials. Her instruction, per Hargrove, was to make it, and I'm using his word, airtight. She wanted to be certain you couldn't come back later and claim anything had been omitted. Carol sat with that. She wanted to make sure I got nothing else but you, she said. Correct. Renata set her pen down. What she actually did was make sure you got everything inside that building. Every instrument, every tool, every piece of equipment, the journal, the cabinet, all of it, legally, unambiguously, irrevocably yours. The ceiling fan turned. The woman who had spent 28 years making Carol feel like nothing had, in the end, signed her name to the document that gave Carol everything. Renata brought in Marcus Webb 2 weeks later. 58 years old, gray at the temples, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades reading financial records and had learned that the numbers told the truth even when people didn't. He set his briefcase on the conference table. Renata had a small one, barely large enough for 3 chairs, and opened it without ceremony. He had been working the case for 10 days when he came in with the first finding. Troy Whitmore retained a private investigation firm in March of 2018, he said. Harmon Investigations based in Houston. The engagement lasted 14 months. The subject of the investigation was the property at 412 Oleander Street. Carol looked at Renata. 6 years ago, Renata said. 3 years before Frank died. Marcus slid a printed page across the table. Phone records, a highlighted entry, a number traced to Harmon's main line, called from Troy's cell. Then a series of subsequent calls over the following months. The investigator's final report. Subject property inaccessible. Contents unknown. Troy had paid 14 months and gotten nothing. The building was welded shut, and Dottie didn't have a key, so he waited. For Frank to die, for the will, for Carol to take the property and sell it cheap. When she didn't sell, he came at night with a crowbar. Renata made a note. Marcus closed the folder. There's more, he said. Carol stood up. Give me a minute, she said. She went out to the hallway. A window looked down onto Strand Street. A woman walking a dog. A teenager on a bicycle. Galveston in November. Ordinary. She stood there until her coffee went cold. Then she went back in. All right, she said. Marcus opened the second folder. Frank had signed a power of attorney in favor of Nadine Whitmore in the spring of 2016. The document gave her authority to manage financial accounts on his behalf during periods of incapacity. Standard language, common in situations where a patient anticipated ongoing medical treatment. From 2016 through 2022, Nadine had used that authority to transfer funds from the joint investment account held by Frank and Carol Whitmore to a personal account in her own name. The transfers were documented as medical expenses and care-related costs. They were recorded that way in the account statements. The total transferred, $287,000. The POA authorized her to manage accounts, Marcus said, his voice even. It did not authorize her to transfer assets to herself. That's the distinction. What she did was use a legitimate legal instrument to do something it wasn't designed to permit. Breach of fiduciary duty, Renata said. Civil, potentially criminal, if we can establish intent. The paper trail is clear. The question is what Carol wants to do with it. The room was quiet. The fan turned. Carol looked at the number on the page. $287,000. Moved over 6 years, a little at a time. Labeled as care costs for the man Carol had been caring for, without payment, without help, without a single visit from the woman who was billing herself as his caregiver. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Nadine Whitmore. Renata and Marcus both looked at her. She held up one finger. Answered. Carol. The warmth was gone. What remained was something flatter. The voice of a person who had run out of performances. I think we need to talk directly, without lawyers. I'm with my lawyer right now, Carol said. A pause. I know you are. That's why I'm calling. Another pause, shorter. What is it you want? Say it plainly. Money? An apology? Tell me what this ends with and we can talk about it. Carol looked at Marcus. He gave a small nod. Your call. I never wanted anything from you, Carol said. Not in 28 years. I wanted Frank to be well. I wanted to keep doing the work I loved. Those are the things I wanted, and neither of them had anything to do with you. Then, but what you did with the POA isn't a family matter anymore. My lawyer will be in touch with yours tomorrow morning. She ended the call, set the phone on the table, gently, no emphasis. Renata picked up her pen. Marcus closed his folder. The three of them sat in the office for a moment, without speaking. The fan turned. The coffee smell had gone stale. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Then Renata said, I'll draft the demand letter tonight. And the work continued. It was late when Carol got home. She made tea she didn't drink and sat with Earl's journal open in front of her, not reading for information, just sitting with it. She turned to the November 1987 entry. Samuel and Ruth Levy, one violin, German or Austrian manufacture, estimated pre-1900. Bridge lifting. Pegs slipping on E and A. They said it came from Vienna. Family instrument. 3 generations. The husband was careful with it the way people are careful with things that have already survived more than they should have. He said, We just want it to play right again. I told him I'd have it done by January. Below the entry, in smaller writing, they will call when they're ready to pick up. They had never called. Because Earl had died in November 1988, a year after this entry, and the Levies had called a number that no longer answered, and eventually stopped calling. Carol found a clean page in her own notebook, the one she had been using since the first week, the one that now held inventory numbers and repair notes and names from the journal she was trying to trace. She wrote, Daniel Levy, family of Samuel plus Ruth Levy, violin 1987, find. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she closed both books and went to bed. Somewhere in Houston, or wherever he was now, a man named Daniel Levy had grown up knowing his family had left a violin in a shop that closed without warning and had never gotten it back. She wasn't ready to call yet. But she would be. Renata found the number through public records, a Houston address, a listed phone, a name that matched the journal entry from 1987. Carol called on a Tuesday evening, alone at her kitchen table with the journal open in front of her. The phone rang 4 times. A man answered. My name is Carol Whitmore, she said. "I'm calling about a violin. Your family left it for repair at a workshop in Galveston in November of 1987. The man who ran the shop, Earl Whitmore, he died before he could return it. I found it in the workshop. I think it belongs to you." Silence. Long enough that she checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then, the violin from Vienna. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had learned not to expect this particular call. "Yes," she said. Another silence. "I don't know what to say to you," he said. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to know if you'd like to come and get it." He came the following Saturday. Before he arrived, Dottie mentioned George Tran, a name Carol had not heard before. He lived 3 blocks north, had been Earl's neighbor for 20 years before Earl died. Retired now. "A luthier," Dottie said. "The real kind, trained properly, with a workshop in his garage. If you ever need someone to look at the instruments," Dottie said. He knew Earl's work. Carol wrote the name in her notebook. Daniel Levy drove down from Houston on a Saturday morning, arriving at exactly the time he had said he would, parking carefully at the curb, as if the street itself deserved that consideration. 68 years old. Silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a blue shirt ironed smooth. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about this drive for the 3.5 hours it took to make it. Carol met him at the gate. She didn't say much. She led him into the workshop, which looked different now than it had in October. The windows clean, the floor swept, the shelves organized, and set the instrument case on Earl's workbench. Daniel stood in front of it. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at the workbench, the tools, the calendar from 1988 still on the wall, taking in the room the way you take in a place you never expected to actually see. Then he opened the case. The violin lay on its bed of old velvet. Dark spruce top, maple back, the varnish worn at the edges where hands had held it for decades before it came here. Carol had replaced the strings according to Earl's notes. The bridge had been reseated. It was ready to be played. Daniel lifted it out with both hands. "My father told me," he said, his eyes on the instrument, "that my grandfather hid this under the floorboards of the ship. 3 weeks from Vienna to New York. He was 24 years old. He had a suitcase, a photograph of his parents, and this violin." A pause. When they got to Galveston, those were the 3 things he still had. He turned the violin over, looked through the F-hole at the label inside, holding his phone's light close. "Yes," he said quietly. "This is it." "I'm not going to charge you anything," Carol said. "It was never mine to sell." He looked at her then, directly, without the careful distance he'd maintained since arriving. The look of someone recalibrating what they'd expected to find. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he raised the violin to his shoulder. The bow was his own. He had brought it from Houston, an old one, the horsehair still good. He rosined it while Carol stepped back. Dottie appeared in the doorway without being summoned, the way she had a habit of doing. Daniel drew the bow across the open G string. The sound that came out was not perfect. 35 years in a sealed cabinet, even a well-maintained one, leaves its mark. The note was slightly flat, with a roughness underneath it that would take time and playing to smooth away. But it was there. It was present. It filled the workshop the way sound fills a room that has been quiet too long. Not loud, just suddenly alive. He played 3 more notes, adjusted, played them again. The air in the room changed, not dramatically, the way air changes when a window opens. Dottie's hand went to her mouth. Nobody said anything for a while. Daniel stayed another hour. Carol showed him Earl's entry, the description of the violin, the note about his grandparents. He read it twice, then asked if he could photograph the page. When he left, he shook her hand at the gate and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. "My mother looked for this for years," he said. "She died not knowing what happened to it." Carol nodded. "She would have liked you," he said. Then he got in his car and drove back to Houston. Carol went back inside. The workshop was quiet again. The afternoon light came in at a low angle, the April kind, warmer than October, but still unhurried. She walked past the shelves, past the workbench, to the far corner where a long wooden box sat on the lowest shelf. She had known it was there since October. She had walked past it every day for 6 months. She had not opened it. She opened it now. The mandolin inside was unfinished. Neck not yet attached, strings not strung, but the body was done. Spruce top, maple back, finished to a depth that still caught the light after 35 years. Earl had left what he couldn't finish in a state worth continuing. Carol picked it up carefully, turned it in the light, looked through the sound hole into the interior. Dark. She angled it toward the window. Something inside. Tucked against one of the interior braces, a small fold of paper, the kind that comes from tearing a corner from a larger sheet. She found a pair of tweezers in the tool drawer, worked carefully. The paper came out in one piece. She unfolded it on the workbench, smoothing it flat with 2 fingers. 3 words. Earl's handwriting, smaller than his journal hand, written with a different pen, pressed firmly into the paper as though the weight of the pen mattered. For Margaret. Always. Carol set the paper down. She sat in Earl's chair, the wooden one, worn smooth at the armrests, set at the angle he had always kept it, facing the workbench at a slight diagonal. The chair of a man who had worked in this room for 33 years. She sat in it and looked at the 3 words on the workbench. Earl had promised his wife a mandolin in 1972. Margaret had died in 1982. He had kept working on it for 6 more years. Past her death. Past the point where she could receive it. Past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. He had written her name on a scrap of paper and tucked it inside the body of the instrument where no one would see it unless they were looking, not for anyone else to find. For the mandolin to know. She thought of Earl working alone in this room for 16 years, talking to wood and strings and a woman who could no longer hear him. She thought of Frank, writing a letter he would never hand her himself, trusting a neighbor and a locked building to deliver it. She thought of her own hands, which had forgotten how to play and then, slowly, remembered. All these unfinished things, all this careful love, she sat there until the light changed. Outside, through the window Earl had built but never finished framing, the wisteria moved in the Gulf wind, and for a moment, in the last of the afternoon light, it looked almost like something breathing. Justice in Galveston County moved the way Gulf weather moves, slowly at first, then all at once, and never quite the way you expected. Troy entered his plea on a Thursday morning in May. Criminal trespass and breaking and entering. 2 years probation, a fine of $18,000, the same number, Carol noted, as the appraised value of the workshop. No contact with Carol or the property. Lila, 18 months probation. Carol wasn't in the courtroom. Renata had said she didn't need to be, so she went to the workshop and spent the morning on the last shelf of instruments she hadn't documented. Her 3rd notebook. Renata texted at 11:47. Done. Call me when you can. Carol finished the shelf first, The civil matter with Nadine took longer. Frank was gone. He could not testify about the power of attorney, about what he had understood when he signed it, about whether he had intended to authorize the transfer of joint assets to his mother's personal account. The medical records from 2016 documented his condition clearly, but Nadine's attorney argued, with some legal basis, that the POA had been executed properly and that the transfers represented legitimate reimbursement for caregiving expenses. Renata called it a gray area. She said it with the tone of someone who found it less gray than she was professionally required to admit. The negotiation ran through May and into June. 3 offers, 3 counters, numbers going up from Nadine's side, coming down from Carol's, meeting somewhere in the middle of a disagreement that neither party wanted to take before a judge. The settlement was $210,000, not $287,000. Not full recovery. Renata set her pen down when Carol accepted it and looked at her for a long moment. "You're sure?" she said. Not quite a question. "I'm sure," Carol said. "I don't need all of it. I need enough to do what I'm trying to do. This is enough." Renata picked her pen back up. She signed where she needed to sign and did not say anything else about the number, because Carol had made her position clear, and Renata was the kind of lawyer who respected that. The paperwork was finalized on a Wednesday in June. That afternoon, Carol sat down with a legal pad and added the numbers. The settlement, $210,000. The PIAT account Frank had opened at First National, $47,000. The life insurance policy, paid out 4 months after his death, $180,000. Total, $437,000. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she turned the legal pad over and started writing a list of things that needed to be done to the workshop before it could open to the public. The list was long. She kept writing. The morning after the settlement was signed, Nadine Whitmore sat alone in the house on Seawall Boulevard. The house was large and well-maintained and full of furniture she had chosen carefully over 50 years. The bay was visible from the front windows, the same view she had looked at since she and Frank's father had bought the house in 1974, before Frank was born, before any of it. 77 years old. Frank gone. Troy under court supervision, calling once a week from a number she didn't recognize because he'd had to change his phone. She sat in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she had always kept, the one that said, "I am in control of this room even when the room was empty." She had spent her life making decisions. Some she would make again. Others, in the months since the cameras and lawyers, she understood had come from a place she didn't want to examine too closely. Frank had loved Carol. She had known that. She had spent 28 years treating it as a problem rather than a fact, and she was old enough now to know what that had cost. Not just Carol. Frank, too. She didn't reach for her phone. The bay was flat and gray this morning. A pelican crossed the window, low and deliberate, and was gone. She sat with her hands folded. Some people spend their whole lives winning. And then one morning they sit alone in a quiet house and realize they never learned what winning was for. The workshop at 412 Oleander Street had been closed for 35 years. Carol had a list of repairs. She had $437,000 and a name Dottie had given her. George Tran, 3 blocks north, who had known Earl and understood the instruments. She had Earl's journal and 6 notebooks of her own. She had Renata's phone number and Daniel Levy's and a standing offer from Dottie to bring coffee on mornings when the work was hard. She had enough. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Spring came to Galveston the way it always does. Not all at once, but in small permissions. But that was months ago. Now it was October again. The same light, the same salt smell off the Gulf. The oleanders were blooming a second time, pink and white, stubborn as ever. She noticed them when she turned onto the street. She noticed them every time now. Number 412 looked like a different building. The fence had been repainted white, not perfectly. A few brush marks still visible where the second coat hadn't gone on evenly, but upright and solid. Along the front, where the ragweed and pokeweed had grown chest-high a year ago, there was a small garden, Texas wildflowers, a wooden bench, a gravel path to the gate. Simple. The kind of thing that says someone tends this without saying anything else. The wisteria was still there. It had not been removed. Carol had decided early on that it stayed, but it had been cut back, redirected, trained up a new wooden trellis along the front wall. In April, it had bloomed properly for the first time in years, purple flowers hanging in long clusters over the entrance. Now the flowers were gone and the vine was green and orderly against the brick, waiting for next spring. Above the gate, a wooden sign, hand-lettered by a woman 2 streets over who did that kind of work. Earl's Workshop. Community Music Center established 2024, in memory of Earl Whitmore, 1922 to 1988. Inside on a Saturday afternoon, there was music. Carol stood at the door and listened before going in. Becca Nguyen was at the far end of the room, patient the way good teachers are patient, staying with students while they find their own way. 4 children with violins, 2 with guitars, a girl of about 7 with a ukulele nearly as big as she was. Carol watched her and remembered a 9-year-old in the 3rd row at Crockett Elementary, recorder in both hands, brow furrowed, convinced she was doing it wrong. She hadn't been. She'd been learning, which looks the same from the outside. 2 months after the workshop opened, Becca had texted, "I'm in Houston, but I could come weekends, if you need someone." Carol had said yes. Dottie was beside her in the doorway, the way Dottie had a habit of being, appearing without announcement, as though she had simply always been standing there. They watched the room for a moment without speaking. "Earl would have liked this," Dottie said. "I know," Carol said. From inside, the girl with the ukulele played a chord. One clean, complete chord, all the strings ringing together, and the sound hung in the room for a second before the other children reacted. Becca said something Carol couldn't hear. The girl played it again. Carol went in. She walked past the workbench, past the shelves where the remaining instruments hung in their places, past the calendar from 1988 that she had left on the wall because it belonged there, to the far corner of the room. Above Earl's workbench, on a small oak bracket that Reuben had made from a piece of salvaged wood, hung the mandolin. George Tran had taken 6 weeks. He came 3 times before he agreed, studying Earl's notes, measuring things Carol couldn't name. He charged nothing. He said Earl had fixed a clock for him in 1983 and also charged nothing, and that was how those things worked. The mandolin hung complete. George had followed Earl's specifications exactly. He had not added anything of his own. Below it, a small brass plate mounted on the wall. For Margaret. Always. Earl Whitmore, 1988. The mandolin had not been played. Carol had not played it, and she had not invited anyone else to. It hung there complete and silent, and she had decided that was the right thing. Not everything needed to make a sound to mean something. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then the chord came again from across the room. The girl playing it a 3rd time now, steadier, and Carol turned and walked back toward the door. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in Galveston, coming in low and warm and unhurried across the water. She sat down on the bench in the small garden, set her coffee beside her, and opened Earl's journal to the page she had marked that morning. She was on entry 214. There were 387 entries total. She had been reading since October of last year. From inside, the music continued, imperfect, interrupted, starting over, trying again. The sound of something being learned. She began to read. Earl had built this room to hold beautiful things in the dark until someone was ready to bring them into the light. She was still learning how much light one room could hold. She opened the journal to the next unread page, settled back against the bench, and in the warm afternoon, with music coming from inside the building that had once been a locked secret and was now just a place where children learned things, Carol Whitmore continued reading.